Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on conducting a job analysis. And actually, it's a little bit more than conducting just a job analysis. We have really looked at understanding what's entailed in a job analysis, but what information that gives us and helping us design a good selection process and certainly a defendable selection process. So today I invite all of you to sit back. We're going to provide the PowerPoint and, of course, a recording of today's webinar to each of you. So please sit back and listen while we talk through how to conduct the best job analysis and what are the methods that are typically used. And then I have a couple of people joining me today, some experts in the field that will really help us understand the scope of validation and also understanding and navigating the legal regulations that surround any kind of selection process. So with that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Kelly Painter, and I'm the Vice President of Sales for eSkill. We're an online testing solution, so understanding what's involved in job analysis and certainly the validation process is key and really a core part of our business in working with our customers. So today, just kind of a little bit of an overview of rules of engagement for today's webinar. Everyone is muted. That helps us to alleviate any kind of background noise, and I know many people work from home now, so sometimes you hear a barking dog or the doorbell ringing, so we've tried to eliminate that. If you have questions, which we highly encourage you to ask questions, and I know some of you may have a lot of questions, so we're going to capture those questions throughout the webinar, so go ahead and chat those over as soon as you have them. And then we'll address those questions, or as many as we can, at the end of the webinar. All right? We will provide you with a brief survey when you leave the webinar platform, so I think it's only 3 questions, so if you have just a couple of seconds, if you could answer those, that would be wonderful. All right, so let's get started. Today we're going to just provide an overview, and I will provide the URLs for most of my source content. All right, so we'll have a complete job analysis and just some different methods of completing a job analysis and what that entails. Deploying your selection process, we want to make sure that we use the information from your job analysis to really put the right selection process in place. And then certainly managing the results produced by that selection process. We have clients in the last 12 to 15 years that I've been working in talent management. We always want to understand what really drives results in using any tool, whether it's skills testing or behavioral assessments or education or experience as a marker in the selection process. We want to understand how does that deliver us the best candidate. So we'll talk a little bit about understanding those results. And then the last piece of this is understanding what are the regulatory standards. All right, what is the source law? And then, of course, the enforcement arm of that law is EEOC. So we'll talk a little bit about those laws and those standards. And then I have an attorney from Jones Day, Eric Dreiband, who is also going to join us and help kind of understanding how to navigate that legal jargon that comes along with interpreting the requirements from EEOC. All right, so with that, we'll get started. All right, job analysis. So what is a job analysis? So one of the key things for understanding, it can be a formal process, but truly at the very core of a job analysis is understanding what are the requirements for the job. All right, so if you understand what you're looking for, you have to really understand what the job is. And all too often the job may not be in the same building as an HR specialist who's been tasked with, or an HR generalist who's been tasked with recruiting for a particular job, right? The job analysis will help you understand what's really required in that job, and then understanding what's really required on the first day a candidate starts work. And that's really how it can best help us understand who the right candidate is. All right, so basically, if I looked up what is a job analysis, you'll see the study of work requirements and appropriate pay levels of a particular job. All right, so let's start there. Job analysis methods. Now there are quite a few job analysis methods, and there's usually a combination of these methods that are really used probably more often than the others. They observation, where we just look at the job and we observe what kinds of tasks are being performed in a job. Work sampling, we may actually experience a job We may look for an employee to log and identify a particular task over a period of time and how much time they spend on that task and what level of understanding they have in that particular area. Interviewing is very popular, is interviewing maybe a hiring manager and understanding what are the requirements for the job. Using questionnaires has always proven to be very successful, especially if you use different perceptions of what the job is. I always like to see the perception of the hiring manager, but also the perception of a fairly new person in that job and a person who may have been there for quite some time. Critical incident technique is one of the rarely used, but in some industries may be more frequently used depending on what the particular situation is. But then there's the functional job analysis. It's a DOL standard practice, and I like that because it's probably the simplistic version of how to approach a job analysis. All right, so I'm going to pick a few of these to just go over in more detail. All right, the first one is interviewing. And I apologize, I'm going to go back a slide. So at the bottom of this slide, you'll see the URL. It is whatishumanresource.com. So you gathered information from this website. So if you would like to get additional information or get any of the information contained on the next slides and you want to visit the website, you can go to that website as well. Okay, so interviewing, if we provide interviews of current employees, we might ask, what is the job being performed? Who do you report to? What are your jobs and responsibilities? What is the working condition? What are the physical demands? So you basically are asking questions of the existing employees to help identify and describe that particular job. All right, that's one way to conduct one. Job analysis questionnaire. If we identify the materials and equipment used, is there software or computer skills being used in that particular job? Are there physical activities? Are there long periods of sitting for office jobs? Is there training, specified training required for that individual, and what skills or knowledge do they need to bring to that particular job before they come to the workplace to start on day one? All right, so that's another option. And the third one is my favorite, functional job analysis. Right, that's where we really focus on data, people, and things. So you're basically saying, in this, you're taking a step back and not just focusing on a single job. You're focusing on the goals of the organization. So if you take an organization and the goal of the organization is to acquire new customers, and so you have to try to identify what does this particular job do to add value or or what is their particular involvement in that practice of acquiring new customers. And so I think that's it's a little bit different look at a particular job and the role they have in the organization, right? And then what level and orientation of what workers do. I mean, what decisions are they able to make? What are their performance requirements? And then of course training content, right? What training will they have to, if they have no training coming onto the job, understanding that they need to have those skills coming into the workplace. If there's a 6 months to a 1 year training program, understanding that that individual will need to come and be prepared to be in training for that length of time. Okay, so it's a little bit different approach on the functional job analysis because you are looking at the goals and how that individual fits within the goals, maybe the mission or vision statement of the organization. And of course, the strategy of the organization is really a compelling argument in this kind of functional job analysis. Right, so those are the three job analyses that I find to be easily adapted to almost any industry. So, of course, we introduced 6 different job analyses in that initial slide, but that's just the starting point. And so everyone needs to understand that the work that needs to get done and understanding what's required for a job is critical for the next piece in creating that selection process. So I would encourage everyone, if you don't already have a process in place, that you utilize this guideline to help you very quickly understand what the requirements are for these jobs, because you'll see how it plays a part in the understanding of what the selection process is, and then of course, are we meeting all regulatory requirements. Another thing that you want to consider in the job analysis is understanding that each person is an asset to the organization. All right, you see that in pretty much every talent management article that you see is people are an asset to the organization. So you need to understand how they contribute to the overall goals of the organization and what job do they need to participate in, and at what level do they need to deliver results in order for the organization to meet its goals and expectations. Okay? Right, so that's job analysis. Now, which one's the best one? Okay, not any single one of them has received the ultimate stamp of approval. Like if you use this job analysis technique, the courts will love you and you'll never run into a problem. Right? Ultimately, it is the documentation that really plays a part in understanding whether you've done your due diligence and understanding what's required for the job. All right? So the recommendation, not just with this website that I used as a resource, but I looked at probably 15 to 20 different websites, and they all recommend using a combination of methods instead of just one. So maybe doing a little bit of interviewing and maybe doing a job analysis questionnaire. So combining the two. All right, that's one of the things. Another one is an observation. Sometimes people remember the job they used to do and now they're managing that particular job, but maybe the job has changed over time. And so I think there's a combination of different methods that could be crafted in order to get at the information that you're really looking for. Again, combination of methods is probably the best. Okay, so now once you have your job analysis, now you're ready to start looking at your selection process. All right, you know the requirements. What is required for that particular individual? All right, so for that particular job. So you may be recruiting 100 people, or you may be recruiting one critical position, depending on the size of your organization. So you want that selection process to be able to glean the right kind of information that you need so you can understand if you have the best candidate, all right, or you have the best group of candidates that are coming in. Okay, so that's ideal. So we have our job analysis, and now we're moving into how do we create a selection process, understanding what kind of information we need. So typically, over in the graphic here, you'll see that there are different kinds of information that you can gather from candidates. You can understand their skill level. You can understand their behaviors, as it may be related to customer service or sales or leadership. You can look at their education if there's a minimum education requirement, and you can look at their experience. So as you look at all of these components and you look back at your job analysis, you have to understand is, what does my best performing person in this job look like? All right, what did they come in the door with? Because we're going to go back to that training comment I made earlier, is are you providing the training coming in the door? So skills is probably a less critical piece of that selection process, or do they need to come in knowing how to type X number of words because you have no training and you're going to sit them in front of a computer and turn it on and show them how to dial out? Okay, so it just really depends on, now that you understand what the job requires, what do you need your candidates to have? All right, so when you look at the overall landscape of the information that you can gather, you have to determine what's important and what's critical for the job. Of course, you don't want to, I mean, you could measure for everything and you could gather all the information about the candidate, but in reality, there's some critical things about that particular job and your successful candidates in that job, and that's what they brought to the table. So you want to understand what's really critical for me to evaluate the best candidate. If your organization has a great mentor program, great training program, and you really are about developing your employees, then it may be a little less critical that they have a ton of experience. And so maybe you don't need to gather somebody, all your candidates with 5 to 10 years of experience. All right? Or maybe you're hiring an entry level and you know that some of those kids coming out of college have 0 experience. So that's a little bit less critical, or it's just something that you need to know. Okay? So that's the first thing that you want to do, is really understand what information and what level of information that you need based on your job analysis for your candidates to have coming in the door and starting work the first day. All right, so next thing, now we start to identify how we're going to gather this information. Some of you may have applicant tracking systems. All right, if you are familiar with Peter Capelli, I love his information and I love his books. And seen him speak on a couple of occasions, and he always cautions that if we over-engineer technology, we want to be careful that we don't actually screen out people that would have been great candidates. So when you're looking at how that process flows and how you gather information, again, always go back to your job analysis and what's required for that particular job. Obviously, if you're going to have a leader who is going to be responsible for generating revenue or responsible for technology growth or just responsible for managing people and the overall engagement of those individuals, right? You want to understand that, you know, you may need a little bit more information, a little bit more time to decide who that person is. So you want to make sure that the application process fits what is required for the job and how much information that you need. Okay? So it's just a matter of how do you gather that information, and you know, there's a lot of applicant tracking systems out there, and for the most part they all are really good at putting a process together and gathering information for you. And then once you are gathering this information, you have to decide, okay, which is the most critical piece? If I have somebody who meets all of the other requirements, is education really a determining factor? All right? So you have to understand the process itself. Are you screening in, or are you screening out? Okay? And so that's one of the challenges I know that when I review selection processes with some of my customers is understanding at what point, you know, when are we deciding that an individual is going to make it through a particular set of parameters, and how tight are those parameters? So one of the things that I want to make sure that you know, everyone is very aware of is you're trying to create a selection process that is objective as possible. And so when you start to think about your candidate funnel, all right, we want to level the playing field. So if I gave everyone the same Excel, let's just say typing in Excel are, I'm using that as an example because that's the world I live in. So when you think about those things and you think about Excel and typing at 60 words a minute, those are must-haves. So if I gave every candidate who applied those criteria, I'm now looking at scores. I have yet to start looking at individual people, right? I'm just looking at scores. Where are their skills matched to the rest of the candidates? That's what you want to do, is create an objective playing field. And Eric Dreiband will talk about that a little bit more later on. But that is really one of the critical elements of a selection process. You want to make sure that everyone is treated objectively, and so that we're not identifying through subjective filters, you know, and creating any kind of adverse impact in the process. So we want to make sure that you understand how each piece is weighted, and how objective information is used, and how subjective information is used. Okay? All right. So after all of the selection process is put in place, be sure that you have the right process in place that will help you find the right candidate, and tie that back to your job analysis or your job description that you've created. Make the process objective, and that's the best way to identify objective candidates. I am constantly looking at information that will help understand, you know, what is the best objective process. And the reason I've working in talent management, again, for over 12 years, one of the key things that you will see is the minute you add a person into the process, which I'm not advocating at all to remove people from the process, but you know, when you look at candidates and you're looking at them compared to a skills test or behavioral assessment or education or experience, and you're looking at that from that level, and you haven't interacted with them, and so there's no, and I'm saying this as lovingly as possible, there's no bias. I didn't bring any bias to the table. I'm looking at their scores, and I'm looking at objective information. And so that's what I always want to be careful of, is I don't want my sales manager falling in love with the sales candidates only to find out they don't have the minimum requirements that we require, you know, from HR and our job analysis for that candidate to come in. And so you have to weigh out both sides of that. All right, so you're going to have some subjective information, but you want to balance that out with objective information. Okay, hope that makes sense for everybody. Okay, so next we're going to start to talk about validation. All right, so I have my job study. I have my selection process outlined based on my job study or my job analysis. I have a job description, so I've created the selection process. Now I have to figure out if this selection process is valid. So we're going to talk about, spend the next few slides, and I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Ben Shaw. We're going to talk about the different validation processes that are acceptable under EEOC guidelines. Okay? So what they want to know is essentially in the guidelines that, you know, they basically want to make sure that you are not creating any kind of adverse impact, okay? And that you're keeping records and understanding the impact of your decisions in the selection process, okay? There are two key points that I'm going to touch on right now, and then Eric Dreiband will probably explain it a little bit better than I ever could. So if there's no proven adverse impact of the selection process based on the 4/5 rule, then the individual components of the process will not be evaluated, right? So really they're looking for a process that does not create adverse impact. In the event that there is adverse impact found, then they will start to look at the individual components. So that's kind of the overview, is they want to evaluate, is your selection process and what are the rates for selecting people, and obviously record keeping will help you with this, in ensuring that your selection process is not creating any kind of adverse impact, all right? So with that, again, at the bottom of my slide, I have the government website that I pulled this information directly off of, so please feel free to visit that site, and of course we'll provide that to you. Right. So with that slide, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ben Shaw. So I've been working with Dr. Shaw for quite some time. He is a master at helping me understand what kind of information is needed for which kind of validity study and the importance of gathering that data. So Dr. Shaw, I'll turn it over to you.
Very good. Thanks, Kelly. When I talk about this, as I'm talking about validation, you all have many different processes that you use, or many different components to your hiring process, and any of those components can be validated. I'm going to use the term assessment as we move through this stuff. An assessment can be what we traditionally think of as a test, whether it's computer, paper, pencil, whatever it is, or it can be an interview, or it can be a performance evaluation or something like that. So I'm going to use the word assessment. When we talk about a validation of your process, your assessments, validation tells you how well that process or that assessment is doing what you want it to do. And typically, if we're using something for hiring, what we want that assessment to do is to differentiate between those people who are best for the job and those people who are not best fitted for the job. And regardless of the legal implications, and there are many, many legal implications, and they get more every day, but regardless of the legal implications, if your selection process, your assessments, all those kinds of things, if they're not valid and they're not doing what you want them to do, they're a waste of your time. Because you will not be able to select the best people for the jobs. There's no way to get around doing validity studies to ensure that what you're using is working and applicable for the job. On this slide, we show criterion-related validity and content validity. I'm going to start with content validity. Content validity is coupled with construct validity, and the construct is what the kind of overall thing that you're measuring. I'm going to use an example from a court decision I read that came down almost 2 weeks ago with a grocery distribution company, and they were hiring warehouse workers. One of the things that they did to select which warehouse workers would be best was to give them a strength test to test their upper body strength. The job description said that they must be able to lift up to 50 pounds. And so that made sense. The construct that they were going to measure was upper body strength. And now the content was what they used to test that construct. The content, in this case, happened to be a mechanical resistance test. And so a person would pull on this apparatus and it would measure the pounds that they were able to overcome. And so they gave this test, and it turned out that they were hiring people who could do the best on this test, even if it exceeded the 50-pound requirement. And so that raised the eyebrows of the EEOC and some of the people who had applied for the job in the past, because it was adversely impacting female applicants. And so while the EEOC looked at their process and said, well, the construct is valid, upper body strength, and certainly the test you're using is valid, so the content is valid. However, the way they were implementing it was not. The way they were implementing it was that they were selecting, again, the people who could lift the most weight, even though 50 pounds was all that was required. And so the company then argued that, well, the people who can lift more, the people with the most upper body strength, have fewer incidents, have fewer accidents, get injured less. And so the EEOC said, that's great, that's fine, that's a perfectly valid reason for using this, show us proof. Well, that's where the company fell down. They could not show proof that the test, in fact, led to employees who got into fewer accidents or got injured less often. And that gets us over to criterion-related validity, where we talk about what the criterion is that you want to predict. In that case, they were trying to say that their test, the resistance test, was predicting which employees would be less likely to injure themselves. And they could have, that could have been established as a study, and different kinds of statistical methods used to determine that. However, they hadn't taken that step. And so that's why it's very important that you do these studies and keep records of all of the data that you have. It was just too expensive for them to come in after the fact and do the criterion-related study then, and to show, to try to show that the test was in fact doing that. So we've got those two different kinds of validity. Construct and content validity have to do with what the overall behavior or the overall competency or whatever it is you're measuring. It may be typing. The content has to do with what the test or the assessment actually measures. In the case of a skills test, it may be computer program proficiency in a word processing program. And so you would have content in the assessment that looked at typing skill, that looked at error rate and different things like that. Those would all be valid content to measure that construct that you're looking at, that makes for a successful employee. The problem you run into, and particularly now, as things are changing faster and faster and technology is getting quicker and quicker, we have people who have been using the same kinds of skills tests or the same kinds of personality tests or whatever it is for years and years, and they haven't updated them. For instance, if you're hiring a database manager, and that person certainly needs to know how to keyboard, but if you've had a shorthand test in place for 50 years and that person doesn't do well on the shorthand test, they might have reason to say that that content does not measure the construct of importance here, the construct of importance being the database management. And so content and construct validity are very important to do up front. When you come up with an assessment or a process that you're going to use for hiring, we take those things and we look back at the job analysis that Kelly was talking about, the products of your job analysis, such as the job description, the employment announcement, and those kinds of things, and we look to see what are the requirements for this job. Are these constructs that you're wanting to measure valid? Do they relate to the job? And is the content you're using to test that construct a valid measure of the construct? So those kinds of things are done to show how well your process or your assessment is put together. To determine how well your process or assessment works, then we move over to the criterion-related validity. That's where we have to determine what it is we want those employees to do. If it is 100% error-free typing, lifting 50 pounds as the physical requirement, if it's making 100% of your sales quota a month, those are all criterion. Those are all the performance measures that we want to see if our test is able to predict. So there are two kinds of criterion-related studies. One is a concurrent study and one is a predictive study. A concurrent study is conducted before you start using the assessment to hire. And that is where you take existing employees, incumbents in the job, and you know what their performance level is. You know your high performers and your low performers. And you have some kind of objective measure to put them in those categories. You give the assessment that you're planning to use to those two groups. You determine whether it differentiates between them, and if it does, then it has criterion-related validity at the outset. A predictive study is after you've used the study for 6 months or a year, you look to see how people you chose or how the people you hired are doing in whatever that criterion is, in whatever that performance is. If it's sales, you look to see how well their sales are. And so the only difference between concurrent and predictive is the time frame. Concurrent is first, predictive is after the fact. But the criterion-related validity is very important for you to know that your assessment that you're paying money for, you're taking time to do, is actually doing you some good in differentiating prospective good employees from prospective employees that would have problems with the job. And so it's very important that you think about those kinds of things as you're doing your job analysis and try to come up with objective, measurable performance measures that are or performance ratings or scores or dollar figures, whatever it is, to use in those studies. The process starts, you look at your selection process results. Those could be, in our case, let's say it's a skills test. And so we've given a skills test to our top and bottom performers. Let's say this is a concurrent study. We just got this new test and we want to see if it's valid. Does it help us differentiate? And so we take our assessment and we give it to our current employees. We give it to a group that we know are top performing in whatever the job is. We also give it to a group that is very low performing in that job. And we look at the scores and the difference in the scores, and if there is a difference in those scores between those two groups, we can show statistically that, in fact, it has criterion validity. To do the predictive study later, we take the same process. We just take the assessment that the individual took when they were hired for the job and compare it to the performance measure as it is at the time. So remember, you've got the content and construct validity. That has to do with how the test is put together, and the criterion validity, which has to do with how well it works. Both are very important because if you go back to the example I was using about the grocery distributor, they had content and construct validity, but they didn't have proof of the criterion that they indicated they were trying to measure. And so those are the most important things to remember about that. Validation is all about how the test works and how well it does what you want it to do.
Perfect.
That's my last slide, isn't it?
Yes, sir, I believe so. Thank you so much. That was a great explanation. So actually, team, I actually learned something myself. So Ben's a wealth of information. So if you're a current customer of eSkill and you have questions regarding validation, please feel free to reach out to your account manager. So the next 3 slides I'm going to kind of hop over, but I just, again, coming from the EEOC guidelines documents, there are specific requirements in those validation reports that are required, so I've outlined them in the next 3 slides. So as Ben discussed, criterion validation and the reports that we that would need to be documented. You certainly want to understand the user's location data study, the job analysis, back to our starting point, understanding the jobs, the sample description, who are the people that we actually put the process through, what time period do we put them through the process, and then of course how is the information applied in the selection process. So a really good understanding of this criterion validation. The other 2 reports, content and construct validity reporting, requires less information. So as Ben explained, we're at the beginning of the process when we're developing the test, and we want to ensure that we're measuring the right things and we're getting the right outcomes. So in content and construct validity, their report requirements are a little less than the criterion. So we'll have those again in the copy of the webinar information that we send to you. But again, you can go to that government website where EEOC guidelines are, and it details out each of these specific areas. Okay, so before we get too far behind, I want to introduce Eric Dreiband. He is going to help walk us through information regarding, now that we have this process and now we've gone through validation, we want to make sure that we're doing all the right things to ensure that our process is legal. So I'm going to turn it over to him to really walk you through a good understanding. And just to, I'm going to have Eric give us a little bit of background, but he has written some incredible information around validity and of course meeting legal requirements at a previous place I worked. So his information comes from a wealth of knowledge. So I hope you guys have lots of great questions for him. All right, Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Dr. Shaw. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the legal standards that govern what Dr. Shaw and what Kelly were talking about. I mean, the first question is, where does all this come from? And it all comes from primarily the Civil Rights Act of 19, which President Johnson enacted to prohibit, as relevant here, race, sex, and other forms of discrimination in employment. In 1971, the Supreme Court of the United States decided a case called Griggs versus Duke Power Company, and in that case, the court created a new cause of action where an employer can be liable for discrimination on the basis of race or sex or other kinds of prohibited characteristics or protected characteristics if an employer uses a neutral policy and does not intend to discriminate, but rather uses a selection device, a test, or other procedure that has an adverse impact on a group of people because of race or sex or other criteria. And then in 1978, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission issued a series of regulations that Kelly and Dr. Shaw have talked about, which are called the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. Those guidelines remain in effect today, and compliance with them is essential to limit and eliminate any risk of potential liability for violations of the Civil Rights Act with respect to the use of a selection device like a test or other selection procedure. First, there are 2 types of discrimination that the Civil Rights Act and other laws recognize. The first is disparate treatment. That kind of discrimination requires proof of an intent to discriminate. This occurs when an employer simply treats some people less favorably than others because of their race, color, or other protected characteristic, and liability depends on whether the protected trait, race, sex, etc., actually motivated the decision that the employer made with respect to a promotion, a hiring decision, a discharge, or something of that sort. Disparate impact is the kind of discrimination that the Civil Rights Act prohibits and created in the Griggs versus Duke Power case in 1971, and the main difference is it does not require any proof of intent. Rather, it's an effects-based legal theory that the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, aggressively enforces when the use of a test or other selection procedure in an employment setting does create some kind of disparate impact on people in particular race, sex, age, etc. This kind of so-called unintentional discrimination occurs when the employment practice is neutral. That is, it treats everybody the same. Everybody's given the same test, for example, but the results of the test fall more harshly on one group than another, and the test itself is not otherwise justified by what's called business necessity or other defenses that both the Supreme Court of the United States in the Griggs case and then Congress enacting the statute have created. The touchstone, though, for a test or selection procedure in terms of whether or not it's legal is whether or not it is consistent with business necessity and it's related to the job, and that's where these uniform guidelines that Dr. Shaw and Kelly were talking about come in. Generally speaking, what we're talking about today with respect to these two generally different kinds of discrimination is disparate impact. That is, an employer uses some kind of selection procedure to make hiring decisions for a group of jobs or a single job with a lot of applicants or promotions or pay or whatever it is, and they apply the same standard to everybody. They pick the people to benefit, that is the people to hire or promote from however the test or other selection device is. And then the question is it legal if, for example, women are disadvantaged relative to men, or people are treated differently in terms of the effect of the test because of their race? The answer, generally speaking, is, and I'll get to the burdens of proof here in a minute, but generally speaking, as long as the test or other selection procedure is valid, that is, if it goes through this validation process that Dr. Shaw and Kelly described, then it complies with the Uniform Guidelines and Employee Selection Procedures and can be lawful even if there is an adverse impact on a group of people because of a protected trait such as their race or sex. If we could go to the next slide, I just want to talk briefly about the different laws that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission enforces. And as Kelly noted, I did come from there. I served as the General Counsel of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission before I came to Jones Day, and so I was charged with enforcing these laws. Generally speaking, we have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's in some ways like the godfather of all these civil rights laws in the federal employment discrimination area of the law. Title VII prohibits discrimination because of race, color, sex, pregnancy, religion, and national origin. It contains prohibitions against both disparate treatment and disparate impact. And these selection devices that are neutral, that is, treat everybody the same but have an adverse impact, those are the ones most commonly challenged under the disparate impact protections of that law. The Americans with Disabilities Act likewise authorizes disparate treatment and disparate impact claims. Disparate impact claims, though, under that statute, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, are very, very rare. They're practically unheard of, primarily because it's very difficult to identify at a large group who is disabled and then measure that in terms of some kind of selection procedure. The Age Discrimination of Employment Act, on the next slide, likewise recognizes both disparate treatment and disparate impact, except the disparate impact cause of action under that law is much more narrow than Title VII because it has a defense in the age discrimination context that is not available under other laws called a reasonable factor other than age. That is, if an employer uses a selection procedure that does have an adverse impact because of age, it can still be lawful if it's based on a reasonable factor other than age, and the Supreme Court has explained that is a very light burden for an employer to satisfy. In addition, there's an open question about whether or not the Age Discrimination Employment Act disparate impact provision applies to hiring or whether it applies only to current employees. The courts generally have said that hiring claims are not available for disparate impact age discrimination, and generally speaking, the burdens of proof are much more favorable to employers under that law than they are under Title VII. The Equal Pay Act prohibits sex discrimination in pay under certain conditions, does not authorize any disparate impact claim at all, and that's because it has a defense available to employers called an any other factor other than sex defense, or any factor other than sex defense, sorry. If we go to the next slide, you'll see the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act is a law signed into law by President George W. Bush. That prohibits discrimination because of genetic information, including family medical history, and does not prohibit disparate impact discrimination at all. So what we were generally talking about with respect to these selection devices is Title VII. That is the primary law. It is the law that the Uniform Guidelines purport to interpret and apply. And if we could go to the next slide, what you'll see is the statute itself, the law itself, sets out particular burdens of proof to prove a so-called disparate impact claim. It's a three-step process. First, the plaintiff, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or private litigant, must prove that an employer uses a particular employment practice that causes a disparate impact on the basis of a prohibited factor. That's step one. If the plaintiff satisfies that step, the defendant must then prove that the employment practice is job-related for the position in question and consistent with business necessity. And that's where, at step two, the validation process comes into play, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Step three, then, is if the employer satisfies its burden under number two, then the plaintiff can prevail if it shows that the employer refused to adopt an available alternative employment practice that has a less of a disparate impact and serves the legitimate needs. That is something that typically comes up in litigation, but it's a very rare step. It's usually the steps 1 and 2 that are at issue, but certainly that third step is something to be aware of for any selection device. And if there is a selection device that's available and an employer knows about, it should consider using that as long as it serves its legitimate needs. The next slide talks about this so-called 4/5 rule of statistical significance. The first step in a disparate impact Title VII case, generally speaking, is there a disparate impact at all? The 4/5 rule, which is laid out on the slide, refers to a selection rate for any race, sex, or ethnic group which is less than 4/5 or 80% of the rate for the group with the highest rate. If the pass rate for a test, for example, is between, say, African Americans and white employees, or between men and women, if the selection pass rates are within 4/5 of one another or higher, then no adverse impact under the 4/5 rule. On the other hand, if the pass rate is lower than that, then the enforcement agencies, the EEOC, the Justice Department, the Labor Department, will infer that there at least generally is adverse impact. Statistical significance is the more common measure, and that is usually grouping the relevant variables together. If a statistical analysis reveals that 2 or 3 standard deviations exist between the disfavored group and the favored group under what's called a multiple regression analysis, then at a statistical level, a court or the EEOC may conclude that in fact there is a disparate impact. Practical significance is a rarely applied standard about whether or not the differences are so insignificant that even if statistical significance exists, it still may not be practically significant, and the employer could avoid liability, but that one is very rare where an employer can win under that standard. The next slide, and I'm going to go very quickly here because I want to get to your questions. The next slide talks about the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. And I just want to point out a couple of things about this next slide, if we could go to the next slide. The use of a test or other selection device is particular to a specific set of individuals and a specific job. Be very leery of kind of off-the-shelf tests where there's some generalized validation study that says, in general, this test is valid for these kinds of jobs. Each employer that uses a test or other selection procedure is responsible for making sure that that test is valid under the Uniform Guidelines for the particular job that's at issue. In addition, I want to point out the second to last bullet point on that page. Good faith reliance on the Uniform Guideline of employee selection procedures provides an absolute defense to any claim, and it cites there Title 42, United States Code, Section 2000E-12B. That's right in the United States Code enacted by Congress. So if you have a selection procedure and you can demonstrate that you relied reasonably and in good faith on the Uniform Guidelines, and somebody sues you, including the EEOC, you avoid liability if you can demonstrate that defense. There are record-keeping obligations that I encourage you to look at. In the Uniform Guidelines, you're required to maintain records if something has an adverse impact. They're fairly detailed, and I just bring them to your attention to think about. The next slide just touches on the different steps for an EEOC investigation. I'm going to be very quickly here. First, they start off with a charge filed by someone, then an investigation. During an EEOC investigation, I just want to make real quickly 2 points. One, the EEOC has very broad authority to request information, including electronic data and other records like electronically stored information, that the EEOC will then use to calculate whether or not any adverse impact exists. If you have a validation study for your selection device, it will provide a very strong defense to the EEOC. You'll presumably show it to them, or they'll learn about it during the investigation, and they may conclude that it's time for them to close up their file, dismiss the allegations, and move on to their next case. Lack of a validation study can be very damaging to an employer if the EEOC investigates, concludes there's adverse impact, and that the employer is using a non-validated test or other selection procedure. Reasonable cause determinations follow if the EEOC concludes there's a violation. They must then endeavor to settle the dispute through the conciliation process, which is confidential. If litigation ensues, as we see in the next slide, in a disparate impact setting, there's no class certification required. Any settlement is public. The entire proceeding is public. Disparate impact cases, the EEOC has announced, are a priority. Compliance with the uniform guidelines is a defense. And on the next slide, I would just have a couple of quotes here from the EEOC itself, where you see that the EEOC strategic enforcement plan that's currently governing the EEOC has identified recruitment, hiring practices as a priority. The use, if you'll note there in the last sentence of the second bullet point, the EEOC notes it has, quote, access to data, documents, and potential evidence of discrimination and recruitment for hiring. So the Commission announces that it feels like it's well situated to investigate and litigate these cases, and the Commission has been doing so at an increasing rate, as you'll see on the next slide. These cases that the Commission litigates can be worth millions and millions of dollars and can expose employers to huge liability. But if there's no adverse impact, or you have a validation study, you have very strong defenses to any such claim, both during an investigation and during any litigation. And then I'll end and then open up to questions on the next slide, where there's a series of questions to think about in terms of your selection process, whether or not you're collecting the appropriate data. There's a lot of information that you can use both in looking at these questions and finding answers to them on the EEOC's website, www.eeoc.gov, and I encourage you to look at that. And with that, I'll turn it back and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, so we do have a question. I'm not sure if we can answer it, but I'll ask Eric. Do you know whether there are equivalent measures or guidelines in Canada?
I do not know.
Okay, so I apologize, person asking the question. The second question is along the lines of validation. Test validity and reliability and other evidence for selection purposes are quite objective. However, how do companies protect themselves when their interview selection methods, for example, the behavioral interview questions for selecting candidates, are challenged in a court? I'm sorry, and that question is for Eric. I thought it started out then, but it's actually Eric.
Well, any kind of interview, structured interview, can be validated, and Dr. Shaw, I'm sure, can speak to that. The first line of defense typically is that there is no adverse impact in the first place, that the employer simply interviews people, and that the appropriate statistical measure shows that there's in fact no significant disparities between whoever the plaintiffs are or the protected class at issue and not. If an adverse impact does occur, though, the employer will have a burden to satisfy this job-related business necessity standard, and if the employer does not have any validation study, that can be very, very difficult to do. There can be other ways. Under the uniform guidelines, there are other ways to do it, but I would caution anybody that if you're using a structured interview program to think about, or structured interview process, to consider whether or not it's valid, and whether or not, if you haven't done anything to validate it, to try to talk to someone like Dr. Shaw and have them review it and validate it. The other thing I would add about that is validation is consistent with your business objectives generally, because all validation does is demonstrate that the selection device, in this case an interview process or a test or whatever, or strength test or whatever it is, if it's valid, all that means is that you're using a selection device that provides the best information and produces the best outcomes to get you the best people for the jobs that are at issue. But the narrow answer to your question is it can be very difficult if there's no validation process in place and there is an adverse impact.
And Eric, I might break in here and just say that the if you're using an assessment from a company where they, for instance, measure personality traits and then generate interview questions based on a person's score, generally you can get validation information from the company that you're using the test, and there are ways that those are aligned. They have certainly got content and construct validity because the questions generated have to do with those behaviors and various things like that, and the tests generally have been validated to that point, but it still behooves you to determine whether or not people who are doing better in the interviews turn out to be the best performers or meet whatever the criteria is. And so, yes, in fact, there are ways to do those studies, the way to objectify that information.
So, Ben, I have a follow-up question to your response. So would you recommend looking at each interview question and having some form of validity study performed on each behavioral-based question?
Not necessarily, because generally if you've got a behavioral questionnaire, for example, a personality questionnaire, the scales or the different behaviors have been validated as far as content and construct validity. And usually in those kinds of assessments, there's some kind of a benchmark that you're looking for through a local job analysis or a concurrent study where you determine that you need people who are moderately assertive and highly decisive and those kinds of things. And if you can show that the people who fit those benchmarks do in fact turn out to be your best workers and on an objective, measurable performance criteria, then you've got your validity covered. The problem comes in if the assessment, again, like Eric was mentioning, if the assessment is screening out too many people in your various protected subgroups. Generally, on a personality test, that's not likely to be the case, but it can certainly happen in cognitive abilities or different things like that. So.
Okay, thank you. All right, it is beyond 2 o'clock, and I want to thank everyone for giving me this hour of time. So if we weren't able to get to your question, we'll try to get you an answer and get you that answer to your question before the end of today. But I want to thank my co-presenters, Dr. Ben Shaw and Eric Dreiband, and just thank you profusely for providing some great information today.
You bet. Glad to do it.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Dr. Shaw.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone, and we will have a follow-up email containing the information that was in this webinar. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to anyone at eSkill, and they'll direct your questions to the appropriate person. Thank you.